Budget 2017 is one of the most important events in India's economic calendar. It does not just impact the consumer, the corporates, but also the foreign investors who keep a very keen eye on what the Modi government will be doing on the 1st of February. What are expectations from the foreign companies invested in India, and especially those based out of UK? We've got a very power-packed panel here. Patricia Hewitt from the UK IBC joins us here. So does Stuart Milne of HSBC. We've got Trevor Bull of Aviva and P. Balaji from Vodafone. Thanks very much, each one of you, for being with us. What is your expectation from this budget? What is it that the budget can do to A, spur growth, and B, perhaps diminish the scars of demonetization?
The first thing I would want to stress is that British business remains really positive about India. And you see that with the commitment of British businesses to a long-term partnership and long-term investment in India. Having said that, of course you're right, demonetization was a shock. It'll reduce growth for this year. Despite that, it seems to me to have been very warmly welcomed by the common man and woman of India, as well as by businesses. But I think for the budget, that means the budget becomes even more important in terms of signalling a very clear path back to high growth rates. And that, I think, can come from solid implementation of GST. It'll come from clarity and perhaps additional investment in infrastructure, continuing progress on ease of doing business. But those really clear signals from the budget become even more important given the hit to growth this year.
Indeed. Trevor, if I may come to you, consumption has taken a hit, and every year around the budget, the question that we ask is, what is it that the budget can do to kickstart the investment cycle? But I think this year it's particularly important because you need to have a consumption cycle restarted as well. Consumption has perhaps been delayed, if not killed. What does the budget need to do on that front? Because consumption and investment forms a very virtuous cycle, and it seems both are stalled at this point in time.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's lots of, as always, lots of balls that have got to be juggled. The reality is there certainly has to be investment to respurt growth and get this inflow of money into the more organised sector. That's got to be mobilised now. There's no point in just sitting in a bank account or it's got to be mobilised. And there's a number of ways that would be positive it's mobilised. For insurance sector, obviously with my pension speciality, pensions and life insurance are long-term players. They invest long-term. They go 20, 25, 30-year government bonds and other investment instruments. That invests in infrastructure, exactly what the government wants. They invest in roads and bridges. If we can mobilise and get that money moving into, aligned to where the government needs it to go and wants it to go, to infrastructure, and build a better society for the population, then I think that's the key challenge. And I'm not saying it has to be there for tax reliefs and that, but find a way where you can actually mobilise the money to make sure that this stall in GDP doesn't become a lethargy. It actually moves forward because the country wants to, and everybody wants to move forward.
Indeed, we want to move forward. We want to come in on the consumption and the demand boost at this point in time because, the focus has really shifted away from investment onto consumption because India was always a consumption story. And it looks like that story has taken a bit of a knock right now.
See, if you look at it from a long-term perspective, there's a huge domestic demand in India. And clearly the bright spark from India's perspective has been the overall economic growth over time. And so you're right, short-term demonetization has hit consumption and our sector is no different. But if you look at it from a longer-term perspective, there is a lot of good in having a less cash economy, and that's really what the Prime Minister and the government have actually talked about. There's money which has now come into the banks and hopefully it'll get deployed in a bunch of projects that from a budget standpoint are extremely important. So what Patricia said about spurring investment into assets on infrastructure, real and social. Real, of course, what Trevor talked about, but then on the social side, whether it's health, hygiene, water, healthcare, those are again extremely important because they're also signals about where we want to take the country.
I think the other aspect here actually is that if you look at the impact of demonetization, it had a particularly severe impact in rural India.
That's right. I was going to come to that, yes.
It's important from a budget standpoint that the government helps to address that. If you look at a couple of very simple things, sales of two-wheelers year on year down more than 20%. Sales of four-wheelers down only about 2%. So that's the urban story is relatively less impacted. compared to the rural story. So spending money on rural infrastructure, I think very important. I think the other area that would be interesting to watch is on universal basic income. So this idea of direct transfer of subsidies from the government.
An entire overhaul of the subsidy regime.
Yeah, and that could help to generate increased demand in the rural economy.
I'm going to start my next round with you because I wanted you to come in on that. So when you say rural India needs more focus of the government and needs more focus of the budget, the government said last time around when they increased public sector expenditure and made public sector the engine of growth and investments that private sector will crowd in. That obviously hasn't happened. As someone who's in constant interaction with private sector, because you're a banker yourself, what is stalling private investment and when do you see that spur?
Well, it is the fact that if you look at credit offtake and you look at corporate credit offtake as opposed to retail, you'll see that there's essentially zero growth happening in the economy today.
Yes.
And that's largely because there is adequate capacity for the demand that's there. Companies have already invested in factories. They don't need to build a new factory for the time being. And from what I see from our client base, I'm not expecting a big change in that picture until probably the back end of 2017.
Okay.
Once we see capacity utilization up to a certain level, then we will start to see that cycle of investment change. I think the big thing that's changed post demonetization is that interest rate transmissions of monetary policy has really kicked in. You've seen interest rates come down for borrowers quite dramatically. You take State Bank of India, for example.
That's right.
Their base rate has come down by 90 basis points from before and after. And that has a big impact in terms of the ability of people to borrow and make a business case to invest.
You want to comment on the private sector investment and what's stalling investments there? And when does it crowd in?
I think for foreign players in particular, finding a way and seeing the visibility of a long-term return, that there is continual change. It's sometimes difficult to see the long-term plan, understand the long-term vision of building a continually growing India with everybody benefiting from that. But the continual change and shifting sometimes doesn't help to see a long-term vision of, am I going to be able to make return on my investment? And that's certainly a challenge for people. So I think everybody believes in India, sees the organic, sees all the components, that there's a real opportunity for us to partner and help and build businesses and build a society. But the journey doesn't always give you the visibility of profitability.
There needs to be more certainty and more predictability. Let me come to you. You know, obviously UK is bullish on India and UK companies have invested top pound here. But if I were to ask you just to step back and see, you know, FDI is a very liberalized regime in India right now. There's a huge scope to invest in defense and yet the investments are not flowing in. What is holding those investments back and what kind of a role can the budget play in this? Because you speak to the people in the government and they say, we've liberalized FDI, we've even allowed 100% in certain cases, but still the top buck isn't flowing in.
The liberalisation of FDI has been really dramatic. I think it's been one of the many very welcome actions that the Modi government has taken. And of course, there are specific examples of FDI absolutely flowing in. What would be really helpful in the budget would be perhaps alongside the 5-year plan that we've already seen from the Ministry of Transport, similar clarity around defence.
Okay.
Because there is big money, serious money available for investment in defence and aerospace, but it'll be invested not just because the FDI climate is right, it'll be invested because there needs to be a customer. And when it comes to defence and aerospace, government is the customer.
Indeed.
So more clarity there would be very helpful.
You want to comment on that? Yes.
Yeah, because you see, we are the largest FDI investor in the country, not just from UK, but just across the whole globe. And last year we got an equity infusion worth 47,000 crores, the largest ever got into the country. But the point that Trevor made and Patricia talked about, a little bit of focus on long-term returns is important. I think the Prime Minister and the government have set the agenda. Their vision is great. Digital India, Make in India, Startup India. There are many stakeholders, state governments, local governments, regulators. Somewhere the individual actions and their unintended collective consequences what we need to look at.
Let's begin the GST discussion with you. A lot of people believe that, I mean, of course, GST is a done deal, but most contentious issues have been ironed out. We will perhaps have a GST between July to September or sometime this year, which is great news. Maybe not April, but sometime this year. What do you expect in the budget as far as convergence of rates is concerned? Because many people believe a spike in service tax, for instance, is a given because GST will have higher service tax and that has implications for sectors like yourselves. What is the expectation on that front?
So I'm not sure we're going to see convergence of rates. I think the broader sort of macro question is what is the government's intention in terms of the deficit? Because the longer term, or the target is to get to 3%.
That's right.
Right? But we know also that GST, the introduction of GST is going to result in some transfer from the central government to the states.
Indeed.
To make up for the shortfall in growth of taxes at the state level. The government has said that to the states that if your growth in revenue is less than 14%, we will make up the shortfall from the centre. And the cost of that, in our estimate, is going to be about 0.3% on GDP. So if you think of the macro target being 3% as the deficit, maybe they've got some leeway to make it 3.3% for this year because of the impact of GST. What I would be concerned about is if we see that go beyond that because of the impact of demonetisation, for example, and the desire to kickstart growth in the rural economy. So if we start to see the government expanding the fiscal deficit beyond the 3.3%, that would be a cause of concern in terms of the long-term stability.
I'm glad you make the point about that being a cause of concern, because a lot of people around the world believe that the yardstick for fiscal deficit cannot be the same for a developed versus a developing country. Let me ask you, it's a tough question to answer. Should we adhere to the path of fiscal prudence, or should we actually throw our weight behind growth, public sector expenditure and all of that? If you actually speak to a whole host of people within the government and people who've submitted the FRBM panel report, they are pro-expansion. They say it's all right if we do not meet the fiscal deficit to the last decimal point, but we need to throw our weight behind gold. But I think there's a counter argument to that. You erode your own credibility. What should the government be doing?
Should an emerging market, developing market, whatever label we like to use, should it be allowed a little more leeway? Of course, if it's investing in the right things, but no one country can lose sight of oil prices are going up. And the expectation is that they will go up further.
That's right.
That is a bigger impact on India than others, and therefore there's got to be a balance of prudency. And many governments would then say, well, you should balance not just spending money with trying to raise revenues in a smarter way. So sometimes reducing tax actually gives you more. You bring more into. So GST might be an opportunity. So is there some areas where there should be a lower GST, because actually, although a lower rate, I'll still get more revenue overall in cash terms because I've incentivized them to go through the normal formal system, the organized system, and I will get tax I didn't have before.
But a lot of people believe demonetization and the kind of money that has flown into the system has given the elbow room to perhaps review the 1997 tax slabs in India. There is this elbow room to perhaps reduce tax rates. Let's begin, and this is a question that I need all of you to answer. Is there elbow room, and should the government be looking at a wider tax base by bringing the rates down?
I think if you look at the combination of demonetization and GST, what you will see with, a few bumps along the way, but what you will see is a very dramatic modernization of the Indian economy. And I think this is exactly what Arun Jaitley has in mind, that India will move very, very quickly from an economy where, frankly, huge amounts of economic activity were taking place in cash and untaxed. Now, obviously, it's not that you're going to be taxing every tiny bit of economic activity in a country which still has hundreds of millions of people living on very low incomes. But as you get more of the economy properly, if you like, registered, because it's becoming subject to GST, you can trace it because it's taking place electronically, then you broaden the tax base. And of course, you're bringing in untaxed activity that should always have been taxed. And that then enables you, absolutely, broader base, lower rates, higher growth.
That there is room for the government to reduce the corporate tax rate and make progress towards its target of 25%. What we've seen in the very recent past is a significant increase in indirect tax revenue to the government.
That's
it's up almost 40% year on year. And looking forward, we're likely to see an increase in direct taxes coming from the impact of demonetisation as those funds get taxed by the government.
Right.
So I think it's quite an optimistic picture. The government should have that room. I would say, however, that it's rare that a big investor will make a decision to invest purely on the base of a tax rate.
You agree with this?
Yeah, I guess he's right. And if I just kind of put it, I think at a macro level, GST, digi-monetization are game changers. But then you've got to basically contextualize it into what he talked about from a returns perspective. Tax rate ought to obviously slide towards the 25% because that's what the government.
But that
in
hasn't
2014
happened despite the clarification that came in.
I'm saying obviously that's a direction that they've said. The sooner they move in that direction in the next 3 years, the better, from signaling the intent. That said, I think the overall GST thing which we talked about, let's take a sector. You need to take a view which is historic and looking forward to. Let's take telecoms, was considered essential. So service tax was 12% 18 months ago. Now it's climbed up to 15. People are saying, oh, should be 18 just because of service. I'm saying it's a little different because it's one of the highest taxes that we have between the license fee, the rest of the money that we pay and the high spectrum charges. Now, if you want to have investable surplus, it's extremely important that you realize that an essential service needs to then be in the preferential rate of 12% and not necessarily 18. So there would be that judicious blend of decision making, I'm sure, that this government will undertake, taking into account specific sector and long-term implications.
I agree with you, but let's just move. Because we're talking taxes, let's talk about the other tax. And I think the Prime Minister made it very evident that there is a case for the markets to pay higher taxes by a higher LTCG, the long-term capital gains tax being reintroduced. Of course, the Finance Minister clarified and that issue was put to rest. But there is this lurking suspicion in the minds of investors and stakeholders that the tax may actually make a comeback. Do you believe there is a case for it?
This is a personal opinion. There's absolutely none at all. I think if you're trying again, I go back to the point, if you want to mobilize and generate things, the last thing you start doing is putting on large penal umbrella big taxes. You should be using all the levers you've got a little bit more smartly to target and align to what you want to achieve. Now, whether that's certain GST industries, products, services that you say, I'll have a little bit low for these because I really want, they will drive consumption, they will mobilize. These ones, I think they're luxury purchases, I'll be a little bit more aggressive on them. In terms of other taxes, corporate, individual taxes, income tax, the smart, sometimes you can move the levers to get the impact Patricia was talking about earlier. This blanket approach, let's have another tax lever here, or let's just do everything here. It never works. One size never fits all.
Last year, the focus was all on NPAs. The focus was all on the bad assets. The focus was all on cleaning up the bank sheets. And I remember having this discussion time and again on recap requirements. Today, there is an ironical situation. Banks are flooded with funds because of the demonetization exercise, and there is an asset liability mismatch there. How best should the government trade through this or wade through these very choppy waters? You have an asset liability situation on one hand, you have a very bad toxic balance sheet on the other. I mean, NPAs have gone up since September 15 to September 16 from 5.1 to 9.1%.
So first thing is there's a very big difference between capital and funding.
Yes.
Okay, so the capital position is one thing. When you have an NPA, that reduces your capital. This is still a huge issue within the banking sector generally in India. That's not going to change. So you've got that challenge of capital being eroded because of bad debts. On the funding side, it's true that there's been an inflow of funding. Now, the problem is that there's, on the corporate side, there's no growth in demand for lending. On the retail side, there is still demand for lending. We're seeing that growing in double digits. So a lot of the banks are focusing very much on the consumer and trying to increase their credit card lending or unsecured lending. And I think what's important there is just to make sure that that doesn't get out of hand and that the credit risk policies that the banks adopt are robust.
There is a lot of focus on digital, on cashless, on credit cards, on doing things online. There is this suspicion, I'm perhaps using a harsher word than he put it, but there is this fear, could things get out of hand? Are we demonizing cash? You have a view on this?
No, I don't.
Because a lot of focus in this budget is going to be on digital and on cashless economy.
I think obviously there was rightful concerns that it was sudden, and there's other forms of demonetization or changing currencies, the European market, when we went to the euro, from the drachma, from the whatever. there was notice period given, and I understand why perhaps the notice period wasn't given here, but that itself shock has a bigger impact perhaps than maybe a more organised approach. And I was able to survive. I have plastic, I was, but most of the people in India I know, and some people who work with me, they had real trouble. So it was a damaging impact for the greater good, perhaps. I'm still not worried about this digital.
A lot of people believe that this budget is coming in the middle of elections. We are moving closer to 2019. There are state assembly elections. Obviously, no populist measures can be announced for those particular states. But what is your broad expectation? Is your broad expectation that this budget is going to be reformist and transformational, or could perhaps the government throw its weight behind populism?
Well, I hope it doesn't do the latter. What I hope it does do is to really focus on those parts of the economy that were worst affected by demonetisation. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand, give a real boost to the digital economy. So that's what I'm looking for. And one thing that would be great to see, for example, just a very simple example, is that the government should give a discount on any bills you have to pay to the government. If you pay it through digital means, you should get a discount of 5%. And just do that across the board. It would be a massive boost towards digital payments in the economy.
That's also perhaps an out-of-the-box idea that I just got on the show, but you want to come in on that, Patricia? Populism versus being reformist. It's a tough walk to walk indeed.
Well, there are always elections going on in India, and indeed I think Arun Jaitley himself was making that point. And I think what we've now seen since the election of the Modi government has been a very clear reform path. And although, 2-3 years ago, people were saying, why haven't we had bigger, bolder moves? Well, demonetization was as big a bolder move as you were ever going to get. And GST is pretty big as well. So I would certainly expect and hope for a continuation of the reformist path so that India continues to become more predictable, more transparent, better ease of doing business. It's on that path. And now it just needs to get back onto that higher growth path again.
Indeed. So reformist on this side, but an out-of-the-box idea, if I can ask the two of you for this budget. What is it that you would want or see in budget 2017? Because many people believe this could be a transformational fiscal exercise that the government will undertake.
Can I be selfish and talk about insurance?
Sure, go ahead.
No. There's two parts, I think. Rather than out the box, first thing was some housekeeping. There are unequal playing fields which exist, both in our industry and financial services and other industries, I'm sure. They really need to start addressing them because a customer needs to be able to have a clear choice of what's the value of the product or the service, not this one's got a little bit better tax on that one. So that's why I call housekeeping. But I think not out of the box. I think probably what I mentioned earlier of using GST smartly and aligning it to where do you really would benefit most, both the people who both be impacted, but also how we want to and we should be growing this society and economy, using GST smartly to be actually drive the right things, that the people can therefore mobilize all this money that's coming, is available, people can actually buy more for themselves, look after their child for education. So, child's education is important. So make sure that money is mobilised for children's education. They're the future. The next generation is the future. So I'd like that to be the biggest thing. I'd like to see the levers being smartly used to really drive the right things.
You'll have the last
word.
No,
I think, rationalising the overall taxes for sectors that are in stress, using GST as a tool as well, as I think is an important point. I would also say stimulus for growth, investment, and also human capital. Investment is extremely critical. The other thing that I would say, if you would look at from out of box, apart from the incentive thing that was very rightly pointed out by Stuart, is remove the word free from the lexicon of budget.
All right, so remove the word free, but that's the view coming in from foreign investors, some of the biggest UK companies who have their skin in the game as far as the India story is concerned. This is their wish list on budget 2017, and we do hope Arun Jaitley is going to deliver on most of that. Thank you very much, each one of you, for being with us.
Thank you.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.